Monster Professor.
Welcome to the Monster Professor, a show in which we discuss and explore monsters in literature, myth, film, games, folklore, culture, and beyond. I'm your host, Josh Woods, author, editor, professor, and monster expert, and a brilliant young writer, scholar named David Schauer, who's also a listener to this podcast, has invited me to talk about the Gothic. He's been interviewing several people because he's doing a graduate project, a dissertation on the Gothic and especially the Southern Gothic. And so he reached out to me about an interview, and I said, oh, absolutely, of course. Not only would that be a blast, but would you mind if I recorded that and just make it a Monster Professor podcast? Because I did an episode on the Gothic before, and I felt like I didn't get to as much as I hoped we could in just that one episode. On top of that, I've had several listeners reach out to me or send me notes saying they want more on the Gothic, and so thankfully he was kind enough and or brave enough to agree to record the interview / it felt more like a conversation than a strict interview, so I'll just call it a conversation about the Gothic. He was cool with my recording it and using it as an episode, and so here you go. We'll call it the Gothic Part 2, and it's my conversation based around questions with and by David Schauer. So it's good to talk to you about the Gothic, man.
Yeah, I'm excited. It's good stuff.
Yeah, so refresh me or fill me in on this project that you're doing here.
Yeah, it's my master's thesis, and I'm looking at contemporary Southern Gothic lit, but I'm specifically looking at how the haunted house fits into that, and what that says about Southern identity or self-identity and reflection of the South through the haunted house.
Wow.
So it's an interesting spin, because I'm kind of playing with the different kinds of Gothic and how they overlap.
Yeah.
Because you look at the Romantic Gothic, which deals with like the supernatural. That's where you get your Edgar Allan Poe and maybe even some Shirley Jackson and stuff like that. And then you got the Southern Gothic, which is more rooted in realism.
Yeah.
And so I'm looking at the overlap between the two of them.
Yeah, that's an awesome project. Do you know if others have? I don't even know if I can't think of any others that have done a project like that. Do you know if you're treading new ground here, or if there's some others you're kind of following in their footsteps, or?
I think there's a little bit of following going on, but I'm trying to move off into my own direction. Yeah. There's a lot of work on Southern Gothic and contemporary Southern Gothic, but I'm moving into a new place with the haunted house spin. So it's a little bit of pushing away a little bit.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? I know there's a new book out now, Undead South, by Dr. Eric Anderson. And that's a large collection of contemporary Southern Gothic criticism and essays and stuff. And so I'm building off of them a little bit and going towards the haunted house area. Yeah.
Well, so thanks for agreeing to record this so that I could use it for my own purposes as well, because I got a few notes from a few listeners saying they wanted a whole lot more Gothic, although they weren't. I don't remember getting any there was actually one specific request for getting around to some Southern Gothic stuff, which I never got into in my Gothic podcast episode. Then as I thought, man, I need to do a Gothics part 2, and then you're like, hey, let's talk Gothic. And then I thought, well, that's the episode right there. So thanks for agreeing.
No, this is great. I've listened to every episode, so I'm excited to be a part of it.
Well, thank you. That's great to hear. So, where should we go? I guess I'll let you lead us then.
Yeah, I mean, we could just talk about. I know we could build a little bit off of the conversation you had with Pickney Benedict on the Adamses and the Munsters. You kind of tied into Gothic a little bit when you went there.
Oh yeah.
And I thought that was really cool. And you were talking about Shirley Jackson and the influence she had and stuff, and her adaptations I thought were really cool.
Yeah.
One adaptation, I don't know if you guys knew about it, we can add into the fold, was the tie Shirley Jackson had to Walt Disney. And I don't know if you've heard this story before.
I can. No, I don't think I know this at all. To Walt Disney, of all people.
Yeah.
Huh.
Her book came out in 1959, I think it was.
Uh-huh.
And Disney was starting to design Disneyland and started to build and design Disneyland in the early 1960s. And then her movie came out in 1963, I think it was, a few years later.
Yeah.
And so he had a private screening of the movie for his Imagineers and his engineers because he knew he wanted to have some sort of haunted house aspect in the theme park. And so he had a private screening of the movie, and they pulled some ideas, and they collected some inspiration, and they came up with the Haunted Mansion ride that's still there now. Huh. And you can go through the ride, and if you have a keen eye, you'll see some inspiration from Jackson. There's one scene where you see someone being hung with a noose.
Yeah. That's
pulled from the book. There's a spot on the ride where they blast you with cold air real quick, and that's supposed to be like the ghost cold spot, right? Or a corridor of doors where you see doors shaking and the door handles jiggling and knocking on the doors, and that's supposed to be from the book and stuff like that. So you'll see some inspiration in the Walt Disney ride, too.
No kidding. I had no idea. So I'm sure by now Disney Corp has just bought up the entire Shirley Jackson estate and has claimed to invent her and everything she did by now. Oh, okay.
Something like that. I thought it was a cool adaptation spin.
Wow, that's cool. Yeah, I didn't know about that.
But yeah, Jackson is kind of, I guess, the go-to when you think of Gothic or when you start thinking of Gothic literature. She's the first name that pops up usually.
Yeah. I mean, I guess Haunting of Hill House was, that it was the first modern attempt, that was popular, and not the first modern attempt, but it was the first like fully mainstream modern attempt that I know of to kind of pull out, that old romantic Gothic, like Castle of Otranto kind of stuff, and update it with that modern kind of literary sensibilities. And so that had a huge effect. Of course, Lovecraft was doing stuff with like Rats in the Walls and Music of Erikson and a whole bunch of stuff before then, but not necessarily mainstream, I would say, for Lovecraft. But for me, Shirley Jackson's We Have Always Lived in the Castle is the number one Gothic, because it's not so like obviously haunted house Gothic like Haunting of Hill House, but it still has every bit of that, just that Gothic feel to it. And the place itself is kind of the thing that sustains you and protects you, but also imprisons you and like keeps you down or breaks you down all at once, and it's decaying, and by the end of it, it's just these, charred ruins that everyone just offers the whole town who have hated the house and the Blackwood family hated all of them, but they keep coming and offering like food offerings like you would for an ancient priest or something, and they don't even know why they do it anymore. And that's the weird, beautiful elegiac ending to it. It's really cool.
Yeah, and a lot of the Gothic work I'm looking at, I'm seeing a lot of ties to family connections or family histories and things like that. And there's this really interesting blend between the Gothic and location and place and identity and who you are and things like that. And the more I think about it, when you meet someone for the first time, you ask them, where are you from? Our identity is tied to place a lot.
Yeah.
And I think Gothic plays into that. You see a lot of homes and families tied together, especially in Southern Gothic, where the family name is almost literally on the house. It's the family house. It's the Woods plantation or something. Like, they actually put the name on the house.
Yeah.
And then you add the layer of the haunting on top of it, and what does that say about the family? What does that say about identity? So it's this really interesting tie between the person and the place.
Yeah, it is. So everything from Usher House all the way up to, Toni Morrison's Beloved, starts off with, it's the haunted house haunted by what may very well be their dead infant, and then she returns as an adult, and whether it's her or not is never really clear. And it's a haunted house story. I know it didn't get awarded as being a Gothic or haunted house story. It gets literary props for various other reasons, but it's a ghost story. It's a haunted house ghost story, I think. So.
Yeah. Yeah. And when I'm looking at, or was looking at, was A Rose for Emily with William Faulkner.
Oh yeah.
And again, like this kind of grotesque realism that's tied to the house, and people coming to the house and the outsiders coming in and stuff like that. And so I just think it's interesting how the South does more of a grotesque reality rather than the supernatural, but they still can't get away from it. It's still kind of related. Things like that.
Yeah, because Faulkner, he's often thrown in there with the main names of the Southern Gothic. But if you think, it was definitely very much the place and that county in Mississippi, and then that. But if you're like thinking about it as a specific house kind of Southern Gothic, like that specific of a place, you got Rose for Emily, I think, or that town, the house. Mm-hmm. And also I might throw in there from Faulkner, if I'm remembering correctly, Absalom, in which the colonel digs. There's this description of him digging this house up out of the ground, as in it was this horrible, grotesque thing to do, to build your own house with the rocks on the land and use your own manual labor along with your slaves. That was the bad thing he did. It's been years since I've read it, but I remember that book having very much the Gothic castle feel, even though we're in the Old South.
Yeah, they definitely pull on a lot of those, like you said, the feel without actually saying it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? We're going to connect it, but we're not going to come right out and say it. And I think that lends to that realism too. So it's almost like you can connect with it. You have something to associate with it.
Yeah.
One of the books I'm working on, the contemporary works, is by William Gay, who's a contemporary Southern Gothic writer. And he's got a book out called Little Sister Death, which the title comes from a William Faulkner quote. I think it's from As I Lay Dying. So right from the title, he's pulling on that Southern Gothic heritage a little bit. But the book is about a family from Chicago who moves down to Tennessee and interacts with the Bell Witch legend.
Yeah.
And then we can go all kinds of directions there, tying to even with movies. If you want to go to movies, this was the Bell Witch kind of legend brought on the Blair Witch Project in the 90s, and then movie, TV shows after that and stuff.
Yeah, William Gay is awesome, by the way. I don't know that book of his though. I'll have to check that out. But yeah, the Bell Witch. The Blair Witch, now that I'm thinking about it, I think they're one of the main producers was from my hometown in Kentucky. So I remember him driving down the road one day, and my mom or dad were like, "Hey, that's that guy that made Blair Witch." I'm like, "He made Blair Witch?" It was for those people who listen to this who weren't born, in the 1900s or who weren't aware. Blair Witch for a year or two kind of took over the nightmares of the 90s. It was a big thing. I don't know if we have an equivalent in 2019, but Blair Witch was hot in the 90s.
Yeah, if any of them have seen the Paranormal Activity movies,
Yeah.
that was Blair Witch, that found footage kind of genre. That's the start of from the Blair Witch Project. That kind of started that.
Yeah.
But the William Gay book, Little Sister Death, is it's an interesting book. It was published in 2015, so it's fairly recent. But he died in 2012. It was published posthumously. His family going through his things and found the manuscript and sent it to get published. So to add another level of irony or creepiness on it, it was published after the.
Wow.
I think that's interesting. I think
that's cool. Like it's a book by a dead man, when it comes out, that's posthumous is a nicer way to say it, but it's the writing of the dead.
Yeah, about the haunted house and the legend, and it's just kind of this cool tie-in together. So I knew I had to talk about it, I had to write about it.
Yeah.
What do you think? What's our draw to the Gothic? Why do we want to read and write stories about places that are alive or characters or things like that?
Damn, that's a good question. I was trying to figure that out myself too, because as I was thinking about it, as I was kind of like in the early stages of my book, The Black Palace, I was thinking about this too. It's like there's something about it when it's a place in the story, as long as it's not horribly screwed up by the storyteller. When it's place, it's something that I think as readers we're very rarely skeptical or suspicious of. We don't have to go through that struggle of suspension of disbelief for some reason. Like when we'll hear characters talk, or we'll see what they decide or how they act, and many of us are thinking as readers or viewers of films, thinking, oh, well, would this character really do that or not? Or that was exactly right. Like the character and how he or she's handled is always on, up for critique. And the same thing with plot too. Like, oh, that's convenient, or that wouldn't have happened like that, or this kind of thing. But when it's the place, we never really question that, or at least I don't, and I don't hear people, questioning where it's set or the feeling of how it's set. We just immediately believe. We immediately believe in like the Tenenbaum house or the Nostromo and Alien, or whatever it is. Like once it's the place, it's like it's above and beyond our ability to critique, or we don't think about it that much. And so I don't, what is the appeal of that? I don't really know. I think also maybe there's something to kind of a place being so much more than any individual in it, and yet it's connected to the individual. I mean, so often when we're talking about, like, T.S. Eliot's objective correlative, right? The external being reflections of the internal. It's almost always the place that ends up, being that, as famously said one time, if you want to tell me how you feel, don't tell me how you feel, describe the room you're in. And for some reason that clicks in everybody's head so much more so than others. I don't really know if I've answered your question though. I don't really know why the place is. It gives you a feeling of exploration and discovery, in that, I mean, what are other options than story world setting place? We've got when we break it down to fundamentals, we have like character, plot, and place, and not a whole lot else. And so if we're exploring character, then we're kind of in psychoanalytic world, and that's kind of been ruined for us for one reason or another. When we're getting into plot, that can kind of work, but there's always a contrivance to that, and so, but you can explore place and just feel like there's always something else behind another door. If a character goes by a door and they wonder what's on the other side and they never open it, like you just want to open that door so much. If a character has a secret that they never told, maybe not, but the place, you always want to find out more because you always know there is something over there. You don't hear people complain about two-dimensional settings as much as you hear them complain about two-dimensional characters or thin plots. And I think it's because we always believe in the place. And so maybe that is its own answer, I guess. Not why do we believe in the place so much is why we like it, but we always do, and so that's why. I don't know.
So then taking that place and making it grotesque and haunted and decayed, and you can add so much more when the reader's just going to trust that and use that. Yeah, I mean, I think you mentioned one time having looked at an article that I wrote. It's Prime Number magazine. I think it was called years back is Think Like a Horror Writer, and I kind of laid out what I think are kind of 4 pillars of what is essentially a horror story. And in a Gothic, the place itself is kind of the source of all 4 of those pillars. Like, it's the place itself that offers the confinement. It's the place itself that brings about decline in the character. It's the place itself that is the other. And it's the place itself that is somehow inevitable. It holds within itself this inevitability. The old crimes that happened here are just destined to return no matter what you do. Or that implication that somehow whatever went on here is connected to your family, which means it's in your blood. And it's so, with a place you can have a whole kind of horror styled story packed up all into one object. And so to do it really well, what you have to do is explore the place, and you get to focus all your efforts on that one thing. Yeah, I think that, and it, like you said, when you pull it off, it works really well and on several different levels. And I think that's part of what makes the specific genre of Southern Gothic so different. It is a different kind of place, almost undefinable. I know in academia, the definition of the South and what is the South is hotly contested and debated. And, back during the Civil War, there were easy boundary lines between the South and North state lines. Yeah. And over time, those lines have blurred and faded away, and now the South is kind of an ideology. And so now we've got that place that we were talking about being even more abstract and being movable and flexible and not having so clear lines anymore. Yeah. I think that's what the appeal for Southern Gothic is specifically.
Yeah, and for the longest time, I didn't really get Southern Gothic, because when I looked into Southern Gothic stuff, I'm like, where's the castle? Where are the vampires? Where are the ghosts and stuff? And it took me a while to get it. I have to credit my wife for helping me figure it out or teach it. She's a huge fan of the Southern Gothic. And once you throw Shirley Jackson in there, Shirley Jackson in the Southern Gothic, and that's her whole literary world. She loves that. And she finally introduced me to Carson McCullers' story, The Ballad of the Sad Cafe. And have you read this story?
I have not.
It will blow your mind. It is so amazingly good and crazy. And then after reading that story, I'm like, I got it. I get Southern Gothic now. I get why it's the Southern Gothic. And so, that helped me understand that part of what makes the Southern Gothic is the grotesque, or taking these things and showing kind of these twisted versions of them in a world that's decaying and and it has this character and this memory, but it's never coming back, not like it used to. And God, so ever so briefly, Ballad of the Sad Cafe, you've got this old, like, little 2-story cafe, building business in the middle of this little one-horse, southern town in the middle of nowhere, down in Georgia. And you've got, the matriarch of this place, the one and only owner is this lanky, tough, grizzled woman with eyes so crossed she can almost like look at herself. and then like, and she's tough and like silent, and she holds all the money in the town, but everybody gathers there even though it's kind of cold and weird, but you don't mess with Miss Amelia. And then one day comes this hunchback into town, this dwarf hunchback into town, who has a hankering for like fancy clothes and stuff, like Lord Byron or something like that, and claims to be her long lost cousin. And then she takes him in, and she for some reason is like enamored with taking care of him and loving him, and he takes advantage of all the bribe, all the getting spoiled. And then her old husband she was married to for a few days and took all his money, gets out of prison and comes back, and so you have this weird love triangle. Like the hunchback loves him, he still loves her, she loves the hunchback, all of them hate the love that they're receiving from the other one. There's this like build up to this fight scene. It's just so amazingly good and crazy, and that one story I think holds everything that the Southern Gothic is all about. It's Carson McCullers, that Ballad of the Sad Cafe. It's amazing.
yeah, and even as you were describing the story, it was like, there's no vampire, there's no werewolf, where's the right? And that is Southern Gothic, these are people, but they're the grotesque, right?
Yeah.
I like to think of it, for moviegoers, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is what set it in for me.
Yeah.
Of the Gothic is, here's this monstrous person who chops people up with chainsaws and wears their faces for masks, and he's this grotesque evil thing, but he's just a man. He's a twisted, sick man, but he's a man. He's not an entity, I guess, if you will, or something. So it's that realism, like this could actually be real people, but they're twisted in this grotesque way, and that's the reflection of the area, I guess, or of the genre.
Yeah, I think once you start getting up, closer to New England, heading up north around the Yankees up there, you get around the New England area, or get to Boston and, and Shirley Jackson's various haunts and stuff, or Baltimore, for Poe. They need ghosts, but you go deep down south, it gets so horrifying in some places. We don't need any extra monsters. Like Southerners are monsters in and of ourselves, I think.
And Poe is an interesting one too, because I've heard people consider Poe Southern Gothic writer, and I mean, he was born in Baltimore, so he's from New England. So I guess there's, but he still does the Gothic with the Fall of the House of Usher, or even Telltale Heart, or Cask of Amontillado. He's got a thing for putting people in the walls or in the floorboards of houses, which definitely at least that Gothic feel. But he's, New England, he's from Baltimore, so does that question the authenticity of what Southern Gothic is? Do you need to be from the South to write Southern Gothic?
Yeah, that's a good question. With Poe, I don't know, because I've heard really smart scholars calling him a Southern American writer too, and I'm thinking, where are you getting that? However, I must admit that, even before I wondered that, when I read Poe, I kind of read it with that Southern dandy kind of accent in my head. There's something about that kind of, that kind of Southern gentleman that just feels like it's coming through. It's either that or Poe feels a little bit old world England, and so I guess, but no, he was a Yankee writer, but does it have to be? Do you have to be from the South to write Southern Gothic. I don't know. Well, when I got the chance to work on some of the Surreal South anthologies through Press 53, it started in, if I'm not screwing up the year, it started in 2009. It was an excellent anthology. Pinckney Benedict and Laura Benedict put that together. A bunch of fantastic writers in there. And then it continued, every other year, and or was it 2007 that it started? Oh, damn, I can't remember. Anyway, there's several books, and I got to, associate editor on one of them, and then I took over as editor in Surreal South 13, and we kind of had this running rule that, if your piece isn't set in the South, your being from the South works, and if you're not from the South, you could still write a Southern piece. Something about it just needs to be kind of Southern, and I don't know for sure how many people kind of just change the name of the place to submit the story or get it in there, because I've done that before. Like, I think it was in the Nevada Review, they're like, we want to publish the story, but it has nothing about Nevada in it. I'm like, I'll just change the name of the town to something in Nevada if you want. And they're like, okay. And so maybe it's just technicality. Like, what is it about, the Southern Gothic that makes it particularly Southern? I guess it has to do with, like, the after, like the sins of slavery and that kind of old world system under the surface, and then kind of the aftermath of being kind of a decayed, beaten down, the aftermath of Civil War, like being the part of the country that kind of now is like beaten down and punished and out of touch with modern progress. And so this kind of thing, like you've been beaten down and defeated, but you kind of had it coming kind of thing. And that's the whole atmosphere of the ground you walk on, the houses that you pass, the families that you're connected to. Like, that's just in that atmosphere everywhere. And you go down south, or you hear about some of the most common modern social problems in the deep south, and I'm not sure it has really gone away. Even stuff like a hurricane coming through somehow turns into like old racial issues and bad history, and people are looking at the decay in the wake of Katrina and seeing it and feeling it as a kind of continuation of this Southern Gothic. Excellent writer named Margaret McMullen did this book of short stories, all connected, called Aftermath Cafe, in the wake of the hurricane. And I think that's very much kind of a Southern Gothic piece. It just seems to be like a new cataclysm, but it's really kind of connected to, in other ways, the old ones, especially the Civil War.
Yeah, and I think if I'm thinking along the lines you are, Katrina ripped down a lot of antebellum homes and plantations and things like that, and there's a lot of social unrest right now as far as, do we rebuild these historic homes and kind of and preserve the heritage of the South, or do we understand that those plantations were built on the backs of slaves and they should be gone and we should not rebuild them? So there's kind of two sides to this view of the heritage of the South, and then we've got the issues of the Southern statues of the Southern generals. Do they come down? Do they stay up? Things like that. And so there's this constant pushing and pulling between the South and the other and the us and the identity, really.
Yeah, it's still fight. I mean, they're still fighting with ghosts down there, and they're still fighting with old memories, and then they're trying to figure out, what are we even are we even allowed to feel any type of pride in our own history with like deep sins being interwoven into them. And, and so there's this tendency to want to like burn everything down, destroy it, and start anew. But then they're like, well, are you forgetting it and pretending like it never happened? Like going to school in Germany and never mentioning, the Holocaust or the rise of the Nazis and stuff like that. Like, but do you want like swastikas hanging up there as a reminder? Or is it, what are you, you're fighting with ghosts and you're fighting with, the same kind of, no matter where you stand on those issues, you're kind of like those family members in those, decayed old houses or even literally haunted houses in those stories. You could always, in a character in a Gothic, you might sometimes wonder, why don't you, if it's getting this bad, why don't you just leave? Like, get on a bus or a train, go get a job in Chicago. But there's something that like pulls you back and makes you have to kind of swim in this boiling stew and you can't get out and there's no right answer. It's interesting.
Yeah, and I think the Southern attitude towards the hauntings and spirits and things is interesting too. I know last time I was in Savannah, my wife and I were eating at a restaurant, and I noticed there was a table in the back corner, and it was a table for one. There was one seat, one place setting, and one little candle on the table. And I remember asking the waitress, do you normally get a person dining alone? Do you normally get that table filled for one? And she said, no, that's for the ghost. And I said, that's right. She said, yeah, the restaurant is haunted by a former Civil War soldier, and if we don't set a place for him every night, then he causes a ruckus and makes noises and knocks glasses off the bar and stuff like that. So we just set a place for him. And and so the way she said it was very just kind of casual, matter of fact, and I think that's kind of the Southern attitude towards the hauntings or buildings and places being haunted is just, yeah, we just live with it. This is just how it is here, and we just roll with it. And I think that it's reflected in the literature, too, of just, yeah, this is the townspeople know this house is haunted, and they let the Northerners move in, and yeah, that's just how it is.
It really is like that, and I don't know if maybe it's like that in a lot of other places. I think I think you can point to a whole lot of indigenous cultures, treating the supernatural with that kind of matter of fact way, and I think even modern Southerners are like that. I don't know for sure that it's missing north or far west, but it sure is existing in the South. Like if that attitude were expressed in Argentina, we'd call it magical realism or something, or I wouldn't, but the literary critics would. So is it Southern magical realism? We'll just call it Southern Gothic, because it very often has to deal with the dead and evil spirits. But yeah, sure enough, I can think of all the kind of haunted house experiences. Or the haunted house talk that I heard from old timers growing up, and it was always a matter of fact thing. Like nobody was like worried about the boundaries of realities being crossed by the fact that Aunt so-and-so's house was haunted, and she would hear something in the middle of the night and go downstairs, and all of her dishes had been removed out of the cabinets and stacked in a single pile reaching all the way up to the ceiling, higher than she could reach to put them all back. Like that's just what happened to Aunt so-and-so. Like, and they just take it as a matter of fact. And I would say especially in Savannah where they're weird and proud of it. I think.
Right. And going back to some of the literature, they talk about the haunted houses and tied to families. And one of the books I'm looking at for my work is called More Mama by Kit Reed. And that was published in 2017, so fairly recently as well. And it's a story about a family home, and some of the great aunts still live there, the little old ladies that still live in the family home, and of course the home is haunted, and it's haunted by a great relative. So even though there's a spirit in the home, it's not like a scary spirit because it's still family technically, so we're still related. And what's interesting about Reed's book is each chapter is told, it kind of highlights each different character. And she's got several chapters where the ghost, the spirit in the home, is the narrator that talks to the reader. And the ghost says, this is when I died, and this is why I'm here, and I want these people out of my house. And the ghost literally and metaphorically is the voice of the home and the family and the history of the family, and no one seems to really be upset about this. And it's this interesting tie. If the ghost is related to you, I guess you really don't have a reason to be afraid of it. It's just Uncle Jeff or something, and then you're just okay.
Yeah, and I mean, you ask a lot of students around this area about had any of them seen a ghost? And some of them, just about every semester, you'll get a couple who raise their hands and say, "Oh yeah, my house is actually haunted, but he's fine. He's a nice ghost." Like they know the ghost's personality and stuff, and they just go along with it. If I don't know if any of them know that they're related to their ghosts that they have, but yeah, sure, why not? Of course, I can think of some relatives that you wouldn't want around, and you would want them exorcised as fast as possible too, just because they're related doesn't mean they're good. But no, I like that. Yeah, because once it's a haunted house, you have so many things pulled together, like the depth of a symbol that Moby Dick is, for instance, like the white whale and all the things that it can, it's not just a sign in which it's just like an allegory for one solvable thing. Like it's so complex that it means a lot, but, as famously said, did Lawrence say this about Melville? I think it was Lawrence said, does Moby Dick mean anything? Yes, of course, but I doubt even Melville himself knew. Everything that such a great kind of symbol and image like that can be, the haunted house can be all that plus more, because you have people actually living in it, and the history of the place is also the plot and the character, and then you can hold characters over as ghosts. There's just, as a storyteller, there's just so much you can do once you have a good setting, and there are a few better settings to play with as a storyteller than a haunted house.
So, with the Gothic being so, I guess, expansive or flexible, you could do so much with it. What does the Gothic say about either the characters that are swallowed up in it, or about the identity of the region? Because now we are bringing in the South into this. So why, with such a flexible setting and place, what can we say about the people that come into that place or are part of that place?
Yeah, I think the characters who are in it the most, in some way, kind of, maybe they're drawn to it because it's a reflection, the external place is a reflection of what's going on inside them, and maybe that's what pulls them to the place, or maybe it's different in a metaphysical way, but the same in that the place itself is a way to look at what's going on in the character. Like, when the narrator in Fall the House of Usher goes and visits Roderick Usher, and there's this imperceptible crack running from top to bottom on this place, and it's going to split apart at any moment. That just so happens to be what's going on in the family, and that's what happens to be going on in Usher himself. And so everything you see about the place is what's going on in the character. And so, and whatever the reasons for getting in there and whatever the reasons for not getting out, I think in a good Gothic are mirrored in why the place is what it is. And I played with all of that in the Black Palace, having essentially one of the two main characters, DeFranco, kind of getting back into the Black Palace because of this, hoping to find something of her father that she reluctantly left behind in there. And so you get caught into these things where you're beating up yourself for your old sins. And then, then you become unsure of what it is you're even fighting for anymore, or what your aims are, because you can't really figure out who you are yet. And so as long as that's going on, this place is going to kind of confront you with those internal kind of issues that you're having. Whereas another character, the other main character, I would say Hava, very quickly gets out of the Black Palace and then goes back in, because it didn't have the same kind of hold on it, because she wasn't letting herself get beaten down and haunted by things. Instead, she was moving on for one reason or another toward other missions and other goals for herself. And so she ends up, essentially, spoiler alert, I guess, getting to be queen of the ultimate Gothic in that story world anyway. And so, I don't know. I mean, if I've been reading a lot of Carl Jung recently, and so I think he wouldn't be surprised at all, even in real life, of people confounding, confusing, or maybe confusing isn't the word he would use for it, but seeing external things and understanding them to be internal or connected to their own unconscious. And as far as I understand it, ancient people are like that, and with no problems. I think modern people have problems with it, but ancient people had no problem like looking up at the stars and thinking whatever is going on there up in the heavens is about what's going on down here, is about what's going on with me, or whatever I notice in that tree is what I should be noticing in my own heart, and I think we get to play with we still get to have that kind of magic in fiction, and especially Gothic fiction, that we don't really allow ourselves, I would say, in modern America elsewhere.
Yeah, and I think you're starting to tie into the concept of the Gothic double, right? Of seeing a reflection of yourself in the monstrous or in the Gothic. Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde is a great example of the Gothic double, of two opposing sides of man within the same character, right? And I think you do the same thing with the Black Palace and DeFranco and Hava, where you've got these two characters. The storylines are intertwined and they go back and forth, and they're kind of reflections of each other. And I think that's another element of that the Gothic can do that maybe other genres can't quite lock onto quite so specifically.
Yeah, and I think, and that's another, the doppelganger ends up being like one of Edgar Allan Poe's main themes, and there's some sort of connection between the Gothic and that doppelganger, that mirror. And weirdly enough, I had no idea that I was so obsessed with like the doppelganger and the double until it didn't even. Like I knew I was, for the Black Palace, I knew I was doing like a intertwined double storyline in this, but I thought I was doing it for different reasons. And then I've got an upcoming debut book of short stories coming out by Press 53 called Oh Monstrous World. Actually, I just got a copy of the cover yesterday and getting the proof today. And it was pointed out to me by the publisher. They were like, this is great, man, but we got to do something about the arrangement, because you got a whole lot of doppelganger stories back to back. I'm like, I do? Do I really have that many doppelganger stories? And I start looking at it. I'm like, oh my God, I've got one way or another looking at it. I have so many of these like mirrored or dark mirror doublings all throughout my stories, and some of them just like literally it's a doppelganger in the story, and I can't figure out why that never occurred to me. So apparently I have some doppelganger issues that I'm just now realizing.
I think it's a feature of not just Gothic, but horror literature and the horror genre beyond literature. It's this reflection of ourselves or our society or what have you, but there's some sort of mirror image kind of idea going on throughout all of it. So I don't think it's just you.
Okay, good. Yeah, then I'm not any, as long as I'm not any crazier than is just generally accepted, then I'm good with that. Yeah, so I've got to think more about like what, what the issue with the doppelganger is. Jorge Borges's fear of mirrors, and especially like mirrors that face other mirrors and create this kind of infinite labyrinth, and his fear and obsession with the labyrinth. To me, and it's all tied up with the double too, because he had some, this name of the story is not coming to mind right now. But this story in which this criminal and this detective were essentially doppelgangers or dark mirrors of each other, and everything in the story is like mirrored up, from the clues to the murderers. Everything's doubled and mirrored, and so he had this obsession with it too. And I don't really know what's at the heart of it, I guess. I mean, Jung talks about that too, about when you're not all kind of individualized and put together as a single piece. You're not at one with the larger unconscious part of the mind, that you feel the split, and so there's this other side of you that you're not willing to face. And so at some point in your life, your job is to like face that other side that you've been avoiding. And there might actually be some like clinical, psychological, or neuroscience kind of foundation for that. I'm not quite sure, but there's something deep about it that makes for cool stories, I think.
Yeah. I guess just another element of the Gothic that we can just enjoy without diving into, without losing our minds, I guess. Or maybe that's the point. We're supposed to lose our minds.
Maybe.
I was going back and listening to the other episode of the Gothic, episode 10 or whatever it was, a few ones back. And you did this really interesting thing where you kind of went through the history of the Gothic, and you talked about how the Renaissance kind of used the Gothic to separate themselves from medieval writers, and how that was kind of used as a divide. And so I flashed forward to Southern Gothic, because that's where my mind goes now, and I thought of it as Southern Gothic writing being the divide between the quote-unquote the North and the South. After the Civil War, it was just all of a sudden those two lines were cut. We started with we had two nations, two different presidents and flags and everything, and then just one day that disappeared. And so I looked at the Southern Gothic being the divide between us and them, and North and South, and how the literature actually repeated itself. The Gothic genre did the same thing over again.
Huh. I mean, that I hadn't thought about it like that, but that seems to work. Yeah, because
like Southern writers will say, these stories, this grotesqueness is ours, and this is who we are, and this doesn't happen anywhere else. It's very regional, and so it's just another way of saying this is us and not you, maybe.
Yeah, I mean that makes sense. You've got to. I mean, anytime you're dealing with a defeated nation and its people and its culture. I mean, it's kind of like once the nation is defeated, the people feel like their culture has just been trashed, and everything that they held dear is now judged to be like false, and it always was. We see that happen with whole nations after a war, World War I, World War II, and so on and so forth. But you saw it, I think, with the South, because essentially it was a separate nation, however short-lived. And then you see that with the culture. I mean, fair enough, as the victor, you want to march in and stomp down on everybody like that. That's what victors tend to do. But sooner or later, if the people are going to continue, they have to find some way of having a certain, of talking about what was kind of magical in their culture and no longer just being wholesale ashamed of it. And if you demand that any group of people or any culture or subculture you demand that they feel wholesale shame for it, that's going to last for like, a few years of tweets maybe, or, a few years of like apologetic, kinds of creative works. And sooner or later it's going to bubble back and you'll have blowback in one way or another. The Southern Gothic does seem to be a way for Southern writers to kind of confront their rich history and also the ghosts and sins of the fathers, and do it all in this kind of compelling way that doesn't necessarily demand apology or shame, from them. They can dig into it and, like you say, here we are for better or worse. And in fact, we're not hiding from the fact that it's decayed, grotesque, closets full of skeletons and ghosts. But also there's an appeal to it. I mean, and cause the South has a type of magic that you just don't really find in my experience. You don't find the same kind of thing in the North or out West. I mean, once you're much farther west than I would say Missouri or so, you're kind of in a different world too. And you lose a weird magic.
Yeah, I think that there's a reason we have Southern Gothic and not, Midwest Gothic or Pacific Northwest Gothic or something like that. Like there's something there that allows it to have its own otherness. Not that you can't have a haunted house in those other places, but that genre kind of latches onto the South for the reasons like you were talking about.
Yeah.
We answered a lot of my questions already.
Well, cool. We're doing well.
I guess so. So, were you planning on when you wrote The Black Palace, did you have it in mind that it was going to be a Gothic kind of novel?
Believe it or not, no. I had no idea. And even after the first draft, it wasn't even called The Black Palace. I didn't even think of it as, that place being the heart of the story. It was called something like the Witchfinders Union, something. I don't remember what it was called exactly. And then I had I was fortunate to have 3 really smart, really honest readers give me feedback on the first draft, and they were all kind of concluding, like, this place, the Black Palace, is at the heart of it, and so call it that, give us more of that, let it tie everything together. And after they said that, I'm like, oh, it's obvious. Right. I wanted to do a book about witches, cause at that point when I started it, I was just not pleased with the way anyone had like explored witches in books or even in movies. And so I wanted to do witches my way. And also I had an obsession with, and I guess I still do, with Jewish folklore. And so I wanted to work in, I wanted to work in kind of a story world where I got all this Hebrew and Jewish kind of mythology and folklore tied into the world of witches. And then also throw in some like modern SWAT team people in there, because I love that kind of stuff too. So that's the only place my mind was. But I was also doing my version of a ripoff of a British action film that was a ripoff of an Indonesian action or a Filipino action film too. So Alex Garland wrote and directed a movie called Dredd, which was his version of the Judge Dredd comic books. And there was a Sylvester Stallone version in the 90s, which is pretty much unwatchable, so don't bother with that one. But Alex Garland's version of it, I think Carl Urban plays Judge Dredd, and I mean, it kind of has that Die Hard setup in which very soon you have an action hero who's just trapped in a single building, surrounded by enemies, and he kind of has to work his way through there and try to survive the night. And there also happens to be, as so often in these kinds of stories, like one really cool villain. In Dread, it's Mama, this lady who's kind of this gang lord, or crime lord. And so, and, you know, that's essentially a Gothic. In my mind, you've got a place that's the thing that's trapping you. It's the whole story's in this place, and you're in this labyrinth kind of running from room to room, secret passage to secret passage, just trying to survive. And so Die Hard and Dread are Gothics in that way, in my mind. I think both of them are kind of missing the old crimes or the ghosts of the past, metaphorically or literally. There's more of it in Dread, though. But I wanted to do a version of that in which I lock a cool SWAT team in a building, but I wanted the villain to start off as a nobody at the beginning, and then separate them, intertwine the stories, and then having that final confrontation at the end. Never once occurred to me while I was ripping that off that what I was doing was a Gothic until after the first draft. And then I thought, oh, okay, so it's time to like get into draft 2 and 3, but just totally breathe and absorb all things that I love about the Gothic.
Okay. Yeah, and speaking of the Stallone Dread movie, I can one-up you. I remember playing the Stallone Dread video game, which was very much like the Castlevania video games, too, now that I think about it. They had the same feel and stuff. Yeah, so now that I think about it, I can see the tie together, sure.
Yeah, because Castlevania, I mean, if I had to list influences for Black Palace, it would be the witchcraft folklore and the Jewish folklore. It would be Dread, and it would be, to be perfectly honest, Castlevania Symphony of the Night on PlayStation. And I was playing that over and over again one summer, and I just couldn't get enough of it. And I'm like, you just get to go around in this place, and this castle is alive, and then I'm like, I'm gonna take my witch story and I'm gonna set it in a castle, and finally it came together. And in the first draft, I don't know if any other writers do this, by the way, but you know, you have proper nouns and you want to choose the right name for the character or the place or whatever. And I didn't want it to slow me down just because I couldn't decide on the right name. And so what I would do is type in the name of the thing that gave me the feeling of what I wanted and put an asterisk right beside it. And then later when I make my mind up, I just find and replace in Microsoft Word. And so for almost the entire first draft, the Black Palace was just called Castlevania. It's like, we gotta make our way into Castlevania. And then later I decided on calling it the Black Palace, and it just replaced all. So, and I'm pretty sure there is no lingering Castlevania anywhere in that book. But if anyone finds one, I'll give you a prize.
That's what that's for. Okay. So was DeFranco Alucard then?
No, she and Haver are the only ones whose names never changed, even from the beginning. I want this tough cop chick, badass, cop chick name. It's like that feels like calling somebody like, hey, DeFranco, or hey, something. So, like cops they just call each other by these cool names. And so I just called her that. And I changed her name in various drafts, like 7, 8 damn times. And just none of it felt the same as DeFranco. So I was never happy with leaving it as that name, but nothing else felt right. So I was like, well, she chose her own name. It wasn't I had no say in it. So.
There you go. So with the history of Gothic being, I should say, with Gothic literature being based so much on history and heritage and the ghosts of our past and things like that, where do you think the genre is going now or in the future? Because I noticed, if you look at Southern Gothic literature of maybe the 1950s, going back to Faulkner or Flannery O'Connor or stuff, it's very much based on slavery and civil rights, and that's kind of what was going on at the time, and I get that. And then contemporary Southern Gothic lit doesn't really touch on those topics anymore. They still do history and tradition, but they're not so much about civil rights anymore. It's more about the person or the family or some other kind of identity. So do you think that's kind of the direction that Southern Gothic might be going?
Man, that's a good question. I don't know. I mean, perhaps it's going there. I see more and more stirrings of people being kind of finding their love for Lovecraft, but also more and more people like being nervous about enjoying Lovecraft because they associate him with racism, and something about like reading and enjoying Lovecraft like makes them feel that they're racists or that's bringing up the racism. And I don't really understand it entirely. But there have been some kind of recent kind of Lovecraft related books that have to do with, that are kind of attempts, I think, at Southern Gothic and in facing kind of racism problems. I think one of them, last year, a book came out just called Lovecraft Country, in which you have tentacles on the cover, tentacles reaching down, and between the tentacles are Ku Klux Klan members and stuff like that. And it's something about like Lovecraft and racism or something. I don't know. And so maybe I would expect more Lovecraft and more obsession with race in that kind of way, perhaps in coming years. I was really hoping we'd get more space horror, to be honest. Like, I don't know why there's not a whole section in the bookstore of just the genre of 1978's Alien. The whole, like, I mean, there have been a few video games and a few attempts at, like, of space horror since, the 70s Alien, but I was really hoping, like, Gothic would just live in space for many, many years, and that hasn't really been happening. Of course, that's not necessarily Southern. I don't know. So, I guess those are my answers. I think it's going to continue to focus on racism, particularly the like American black racism, because the other types of racism don't seem to matter much to Americans. And then love more Lovecraft as people are discovering it and also feeling nervous about racism too. I had to go into a high school for to visit with / evaluate some dual credit teacher thing. And it was like this, kind of like a really prim and proper, private Catholic school. And so I'm waiting in the principal's office to get clearance to walk down the hallway and stuff. And then there's some young girl there with this massive book she's carrying. She's signing out. And I'm kind of like glimpsing at the book to find out what it is, and it's Lovecraft across the front. I'm like, hey, you read Lovecraft? She's like, I don't even know what it is, but all my friends are obsessed with it, and I can't wait to read it. They said it's really freaky. I'm like, and she seemed like she was kind of like hiding it or embarrassed to say it. So, like, Lovecraft is like being slipped from hand to hand and is the cool underground thing in Catholic high schools, junior highs or high schools, I guess. I don't know. It's weird. So I expect more Lovecraft to continue.
Okay. Do you think the other mediums and genres are kind of pushing that? I know there's supposed to be a new Lovecraft video game out, and I heard rumors of a TV show. And I know the Shirley Jackson's Haunting of Hill House had the Netflix show that was everybody seeing its big success. So do you think the other mediums are kind of pushing the Gothic horror genre a little bit?
Maybe. I mean, maybe. I think that's possible, and I think we're seeing that kind of Lovecraft popping up elsewhere. I think it's got to be acknowledged that it hasn't. Nothing of Lovecraft's has ever successfully been filmed. We've got a lot of like attempts at Lovecraft stuff, and some of it is delightful in how bad it is, like Reanimator kind of stuff. But I don't think anything has really done it right. And so I think that's maybe in the back of everyone's mind. Plus it's public domain stuff, so you can do anything you want to with it without getting sued by anyone. That's a big reason. But he's hugely influential and continues to be, and that's never going to go away. Well, not never. That was not going to go away for a long time. But there are other things coming up, within the next year or so that are kind of getting back into that, like focus on, the Universal Studios monsters, Hellboy reboots. I think there's that stuff, not necessarily Southern Gothic, but, those kinds of, there seems to be a resurgence and interest in that. I also think as you're going to see the generation who got into reading through Harry Potter, as they're getting older and get in establishing careers and they're creating stuff, I think you're going to see more like, Hogwarts School of Magic, derived things, that maybe start blending up, because they grew up with like Harry Potter and Twilight, right? And so I expect, I don't know, maybe 5 to 10 years, you're going to see, that generation of readers kind of giving us stuff that blends kind of vampire romance and schools of wizardry. And I think it could be pretty cool.
Yeah, it could definitely, you'll start to see, the influence between the two, and, just like we can do with the Gothic and stuff, we can start to see Poe in contemporary Gothic, and we can see Jackson and Walt Disney and stuff like that. Like, we're going to start seeing the blending and the overlapping, and I think that's what literature can do, and I think that's what makes Gothic horror monster literature so special, is it could do that and still frighten us or excite us at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Those were my questions. I don't know. Was there anything else you wanted to talk about with the Gothic?
I felt like this was a really good conversation. I enjoyed it, quite a bit. So I don't know, I don't know if I gave you anything that's going to be useful for your dissertation or not. But I had fun with it, and I think listeners are going to really enjoy this conversation too, I think. So yeah, so thanks for thinking of me and reaching out and inviting me for a talk and agreeing to have it recorded and broadcast.
Yeah, well, no, thank you for sitting down and talking. Yeah, I'm definitely going to pull a lot of stuff out of this. I think it'll be good. I'm looking forward to the books coming out. You got to keep us updated when that's going to happen. So, yeah, I think that'll be really cool.
Well, yeah, and will do, and make sure you keep me in the loop about this project, because I can't wait to read this, and I think I'll have a lot to learn from it. And you've already set me on some cool readings that I haven't explored yet either. So I'm looking forward to that.
Okay, and if you have any time to do any writing, I found a journal that was looking for submissions the other day, and I thought of you right away. It's the Journal of Dracula Studies. Looking for
No kidding. I had no idea this even existed.
Yeah, I'm not making this up. It's published by the University of Transylvania. I'm going to guess it's real. I'm not sure, but I'll send you the link and we can figure this out. But I immediately thought of you and what you can do.
That's funny. Yeah, it's like Miskatonic University or something like that. But it's real. You want it to be real, and it is. Okay, so Journal of Dracula Studies. We'll have to get into that. because I am realizing now, and if I can, I'm gonna reach out to the brilliant scholar Tom Shippey soon, the Tolkien scholar and medieval Anglo-Saxon scholar Tom Shippey soon. I'm gonna pick his brain about this, but as I get deeper into this Tolkien literature class that I'm into this semester, and in studying more on Tolkien's notes about things, I'm realizing how much of his ring wraiths that he took straight from Bram Stoker's version of Dracula. And I'm just this weekend, I'm kind of started piecing this together. So I don't know, maybe I'll put something together that either Tolkien studies or Dracula studies might like. I don't know.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that would be pretty cool.
Right. Well, thanks again, man. It's been really fun talking to you. Let me know how this project goes, and
yeah. Let me know about your projects too. It was great. I like talking to you.